The morning of August 17th, 1943 broke hot and humid over Dobodura airfield in New Guinea. Technical Sergeant James McKenna stood on the flight line, watching Lieutenant Robert Hayes climb into the cockpit of a P-38 Lightning that McKenna had worked on through the night. The twin-boomed fighter gleamed silver-grey in the early tropical light, its Allison engines still cool, waiting. McKenna didn't tell Hayes what he'd done. Didn't mention the 6-inch piece of piano wire he'd bent into a Z-shape and installed in the control cable system without authorization from anyone. Engineering manuals said the cable tension was within specifications. Maintenance officers called it acceptable tolerance. They were wrong. McKenna knew they were wrong because he'd watched 11 pilots die in the last 4 months, proving it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from. Today, the problem announced itself the same way every time. A P-38 pilot would spot a Japanese Zero on his tail. He'd slam the control stick, left or right, trying to brake. And for 3/8 of an inch, for a fraction of a second that felt like eternity, nothing would happen. The cables had slack. The ailerons would respond, but late, too late. By the time the Lightning began its turn, the Zero's 20mm cannons had already spoken. 3/8 of an inch, less than half an inch of cable slack in a system 30 feet long. It sounds trivial. In a machine shop, you'd never notice it. But at 300 miles per hour, at 8,000 feet, with a Zero pilot who'd trained for 5 years lining up his guns, 3/8 of an inch was the distance between life and death. The P-38 Lightning was supposed to dominate Pacific skies. Lockheed's twin-engine masterpiece, designed by Kelly Johnson's team, could fly farther, faster, and higher than anything Japan fielded. On paper, the Lightning should have massacred Zeros. 2 Allison V 1,710 engines producing 1,400 horsepower each. Top speed 414 miles per hour. Service ceiling 39,000 feet. 4 50-caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon clustered in the nose, all firing through the propeller arc without synchronization gear. The Zero's specifications read like a suicide note by comparison. Single Nakajima Sakai engine producing barely 1,000 horsepower. Maximum speed 331 miles per hour. Service ceiling 33,000 feet. 2 rifle-caliber machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. Lightly built, minimal armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks. One good burst from a Lightning should have torn it apart. But numbers don't fight dogfights. Pilots do. And in the first 8 months of 1943, Japanese pilots were killing American Lightning pilots at rates that made 5th Air Force commanders sick. The kill ratio over New Guinea between January and August 1943 told a story that nobody at Lockheed or Wright Field wanted to hear. For every 2 Zeros shot down, 1 P-38 went down. Sometimes the ratio was worse. On particularly brutal days, it approached 1-to-1. These weren't acceptable losses. These were disaster losses. The kind that meant you were losing the air war. Pilots started calling the P-38 assignments. That's what they wrote in their diaries, in letters home that censors sometimes let through. I've got an assignment flying Lightnings. Not a mission, an assignment. The kind that came with low odds of completion. The problem wasn't the engines or the guns or the speed. The problem was that the P-38 couldn't turn with a Zero, couldn't dogfight, couldn't twist and roll and dance in the vertical plane where Japanese pilots had spent years perfecting their craft. American pilots had superior aircraft in almost every measurable category, and they were dying because of 3/8 of an inch of slack in steel cable. Lockheed's engineers had designed the P-38's control system with standard tolerances. The ailerons, elevators, and rudder were connected to the pilot's stick and pedals through a series of cables running the length of the aircraft. In the factory, in the testing facilities at Burbank, those cables were tensioned to exact specifications. 40 pounds of tension per cable, measured, calibrated, documented. What the engineers didn't account for was heat. Pacific heat, New Guinea heat, the kind of heat that made metal expand, that made cables stretch microscopically over hundreds of flight hours, the kind of heat that accumulated in aircraft that flew 6, 7, 8 missions per week with minimal maintenance time between sorties. By the time a P-38 had been in theatre for 3 months, those perfectly tensioned cables had developed slack. Not much. Just enough that when a pilot moved the stick, the cable had to take up that slack before the control surface moved. 3/8 of an inch of dead zone where the pilot's input produced no response. 3/8 of an inch translated to roughly 1/10 of a second of delay. 1/10 of a second sounds insignificant, but at combat speed, with the aircraft covering 440 feet per second, 1/10 of a second meant the airplane travelled 44 feet before responding to pilot input. 44 feet was 2 fuselage lengths, enough distance for a zero pilot to adjust his aim, enough time for death to become inevitable instead of avoidable. Major Thomas Lynch, commander of the 39th Fighter Squadron at Dobodura, had filed 3 separate reports about the control response problem. He'd explained it to group headquarters. He'd demonstrated it to visiting maintenance officers. He'd even put Lieutenant Colonel George Prentice in the cockpit of a 3-month-old P-38 and had him try to execute a snap roll. Prentice felt the delay, acknowledged it, said he'd send the report up to 5th Air Force headquarters in Brisbane. Nothing changed. The engineering manual said cable tension was within specification. Therefore, no problem existed. Therefore, pilots needed better training. Therefore, the losses were attributed to pilot error or Japanese numerical superiority, or any explanation that didn't require anyone to admit that the Lightning's control system had a flaw that headquarters couldn't fix. James McKenna wasn't an engineer. He'd never been to college. His expertise came from 12 years of keeping machinery running. First, in his father's garage in Dayton, Ohio, fixing cars and tractors. Then, in the Army Air Corps after Pearl Harbor, assigned to aircraft maintenance because the service needed mechanics more than it needed infantrymen. He'd arrived in New Guinea in December of 1942, part of the ground echelon supporting the 5th Air Force's fighter groups. His job was fixing broken P-38 seconds, replacing damaged parts, keeping the aircraft flyable. It was repetitive work, unglamorous work, the kind of work that nobody notices until it doesn't get done. But McKenna paid attention. He watched pilots, listened to them talk after missions, noticed patterns that maintenance officers missed because they didn't spend hours every day around the men who flew combat. He noticed that pilots who survived multiple engagements with Zeros all had the same habit. They'd tighten their control cables before every mission, not through official channels, not through work orders. They'd just ask their crew chief to crank an extra half turn on the cable tensioners, unofficially, quietly. In violation of the technical manual specifications, the pilots who didn't do this, the replacement pilots fresh from the States who flew by the book aircraft, died faster. McKenna started tracking it, not formally, just names and dates in a notebook he kept in his footlocker. New pilot arrives, flies a stock P-38, gets bounced by Zeros, dies within 6 missions. Pilot who flies a cable-tightened aircraft survives longer, sometimes much longer. The correlation was too obvious to ignore, and yet headquarters was ignoring it. Because tightening the cables beyond specification wasn't authorized, because it put stress on the control surface attachments, because it might cause premature wear on the pulleys and fairleads, because the manual said 40 pounds of tension, not 50, not 60. McKenna understood the bureaucratic logic. He'd been in the army long enough to know how regulations worked, but he also understood physics. Understood that a cable under tension responded instantly to input, understood that eliminating slack eliminated delay, understood that pilots were dying because engineers in California were more concerned about component lifespan than combat effectiveness. On August 16, 1943, McKenna watched Lieutenant William Morrissey die. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Morrissey was 22 years old, had been in theatre for 6 weeks, flew a P-38F that had been delivered 3 months earlier, and had accumulated 400 flight hours without any major cable maintenance. Morrissey's squadron had bounced a formation of Japanese bombers over Leh. The bombers had 0 escorts. Morrissey got separated from his flight during the initial attack. A 0 got on his tail. Morrissey broke left. The P-38 responded late. Not much, just enough. The 0 fired a 2-second burst. 20mm cannon shells walked up the Lightning's left wing, through the engine nacelle, into the cockpit. The P-38 went into a spin. Morrissey didn't bail out, probably killed instantly. The wreckage scattered across 300 yards of jungle 30 miles from base. Search parties found pieces 2 days later. McKenna had signed off on that aircraft's pre-flight inspection that morning. Everything within specification. Engines good, control surfaces functional, cable tension 40 pounds. By the book perfect. And the pilot was dead. That night, McKenna decided that specifications could go to hell. He knew that standard cable tensioners couldn't fix the problem. The tensioners were designed for 40 pounds of tension. You could crank them tighter, but the adjustment was crude. Too much tension could bind the controls or snap a cable. You needed something that could add just enough tension to eliminate slack while maintaining smooth control movement. McKenna had been thinking about this problem for weeks. The solution came from an unlikely source. 2 weeks earlier, he'd been helping repair a B-17 that had belly-landed after losing its hydraulics. The bomber's control cables had stretched during the emergency landing. The crew chief had fabricated a temporary tensioner using a piece of baling wire bent into a zigzag pattern to take up the slack. It was crude, unauthorized. Exactly the kind of field expedient fix that maintenance manuals warned against. But it worked. The B-17 flew back to Australia for proper repairs with that baling wire tensioner in place. McKenna had piano wire. Real piano wire, high carbon steel, incredibly strong for its diameter. He'd scrounged it from a destroyed Japanese aircraft months earlier. Japanese engineers used piano wire in their control systems. McKenna had saved a few feet of it, thinking it might be useful someday. On the night of August 16th, in the maintenance tent at Dobodura, by the light of kerosene lamps and under a mosquito net, McKenna bent a 6-inch length of piano wire into a Z shape, 3 bends, clean angles. He tested it against a cable from a junked P-38 tail section. The wire slipped into the cable housing, grabbed the control cable, added just enough tension to eliminate slack without binding. It was elegant, simple, completely unauthorized. If an engineering officer saw it, McKenna would face disciplinary action. If it failed in flight, the pilot could lose control and die, and McKenna would face court-martial. If it worked, McKenna would have violated regulations to save lives, and the Army Air Force didn't give medals for breaking rules. He installed it anyway. Lieutenant Robert Hayes's P-38 was scheduled for a dawn patrol on August 17th. Hayes was 24 years old, from Pennsylvania, and had survived 9 combat missions. Not a rookie, but not a veteran either. Somewhere in that dangerous middle ground where pilots had enough experience to be confident but not enough to be truly skilled. McKenna chose Hayes's aircraft deliberately. Not because Hayes was expendable, because Hayes was methodical, the kind of pilot who filed detailed after-action reports, who noticed differences in how his aircraft handled, who could articulate what worked and what didn't. If the modification made a difference, Hayes would recognize it and document it. McKenna installed the piano wire tensioner at 0300 hours, disconnected the aileron control cable at the wing root, slipped the Z-shaped wire into the cable housing, reconnected everything, checked the control surface movement, smooth, no binding, no excessive resistance. The stick force felt normal, but the response was instantaneous. No delay, no slack. He didn't write up the modification, didn't log it in the aircraft's maintenance record, didn't tell the crew chief, didn't inform the engineering officer. He just signed off the pre-flight inspection form and walked away. At 0540 hours, Hayes climbed into the cockpit. ran through his pre-flight checks. Engines started clean. Oil pressure good. All instruments green. He taxied to the runway, ran up the engines, and lifted off into a sky that was just beginning to lighten in the east. The mission was a standing patrol over Leh Harbor. Intelligence reported that Japanese supply convoys were running cargo into the port at dawn, trying to avoid Allied bombers by unloading quickly and dispersing before daylight made them vulnerable. Fighter patrols were supposed to catch them in the act and disrupt the operations. Hayes flew with 3 other P-38 seconds from the 39th Fighter Squadron. They climbed to 8,000 feet and turned northwest toward the target area. The air was smooth, the visibility excellent. Below them, the jungle stretched unbroken to the horizon, green and hostile and indifferent. At 06:15, they spotted the convoy. 3 Japanese cargo vessels anchored in Leh Harbor, surrounded by barges ferrying supplies to shore. And above the ships, circling like sharks, 6 Mitsubishi A6M0s providing air cover. The Zero pilots saw the P-38 seconds at the same moment. Both formations turned toward each other. The standard opening move. See who blinks first. See who has altitude advantage. See who makes the first mistake. Major Lynch, leading the patrol, called the bounce on the radio. Standard tactics. Dive on the Zeros, make one high-speed pass, climb back to altitude using the P-38's superior speed. Don't get drawn into a turning fight. Don't dogfight. The Lightning couldn't win that game. Except the Zeros didn't cooperate. They climbed to meet the diving P-38 seconds. And one Zero pilot, either very skilled or very aggressive or both, reversed hard and got on Hayes's tail as the Lightnings pulled out of their dive. Hayes saw him in the mirror. Zero at 6 o'clock, 300 yards, closing. The Zero pilot was setting up for a deflection shot. Hayes needed to brake. Now, hard left, maximum deflection. Make the Zero overshoot or break off, or lose his firing solution. Hayes slammed the control stick left, and the P-38 responded instantly, not after 3/8 of an inch of slack, not after a 1/10 of a second delay. Instantly, the ailerons bit into the air and the Lightning rolled left so hard that Hayes felt his vision tunnel from the G-force. The airframe groaned. The engines screamed. The aircraft twisted in a direction that Zeros weren't supposed to be able to follow. The Zero pilot tried to follow, pulled his stick, back, rolled left, tried to stay with the Lightning, but the P-38 had already reversed. Hayes rolled back right, pulled hard, brought the nose around. The Zero was suddenly in front of him, belly exposed, pilot committed to a turn he couldn't complete. Hayes squeezed the trigger. All 5 guns fired. 4 50 caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon converging on a point 300 yards ahead. The Zero took the burst through the wing route. The fuel tank ignited. The aircraft came apart in mid-air, scattering burning pieces across 2,000 feet of vertical space. Hayes didn't have time to register the kill. Another Zero was diving on him from above. He broke right this time. Same instant response. The Lightning snapped into the brake faster than Hayes expected. He overcompensated, eased the stick, brought the aircraft into a climbing spiral. The Zero tried to follow, stalled at the top of the climb, fell off to the left. Hayes was waiting. He'd anticipated the cut stall, had positioned himself for the shot. The Zero fell into his gun sight like it was on rails. He fired again. 2-second burst. The Zero's engine exploded. The pilot bailed out at 4,000 feet. His parachute opened just before he hit the jungle canopy. Hayes climbed back to altitude. His wingman was shouting on the radio, something about Zeros everywhere. Hayes scanned the sky, spotted a third Zero chasing his wingman's P-38. The wingman was trying to outrun it, not working. The Zero was gaining. Hayes dove, full throttle. Both engines at war emergency power. The Lightning accelerated like a falling safe. He closed on the Zero from above and behind. The Zero pilot never saw him. Hayes fired from 200 yards. The burst hit the Zero's tail section, severed the elevator controls. The aircraft pitched down violently and went into the jungle at a 45-degree angle. 3 Zeros destroyed in 7 minutes. Hayes climbed back to altitude, rejoined the formation, and returned to base with his wingman intact and fuel to spare. When he shut down the engines back at Dobodura, his hands were shaking, not from fear, from adrenaline, from the realization that his aircraft had just done things that P-38 seconds weren't supposed to be able to do. He found McKenna on the flight line. "What did you do to my airplane?" McKenna looked at him. "Cable maintenance. Why?" "That thing turned like it was on rails. I've never felt response like that." "Good response or bad response?" "Good. Very good. What specifically did you do?" McKenna told him about the piano wire tensioner, showed him the modification, explained the theory. Hayes listened, nodded, and then said something that McKenna hadn't expected. "I want you to do this to every aircraft in the squadron. Tonight. Don't ask permission. Just do it." "Sir, that's not authorized. I just killed 3 Zeros because you gave me an aircraft that responds when I tell it to. Every pilot in this squadron deserves the same chance. Do the modification." That night, McKenna installed piano wire tensioners in 4 more P-38 seconds. He worked with 2 other mechanics who'd been watching, showed them how to bend the wire, where to install it, how to check the control surface response. They didn't ask questions, didn't file paperwork, just did the work. By August 20th, 12 aircraft had the modification. By August 25th, 23 aircraft. By September 1st, 40 P-38 seconds at Dobodura were flying with unauthorized piano wire tensioners that gave them control response that their engineering specifications said was impossible. And the pilots noticed. They didn't know what had changed. Most of them had no idea that their control cables had been modified. They just knew that their aircraft suddenly handled better, responded faster, turned tighter. The P-38 seconds that had felt sluggish and unresponsive now felt alive in their hands. The kill ratio started changing. September 19, 43 saw 5th Air Force P-38 squadrons achieve a 2-to-1 kill ratio against Zeros for the first time since arriving in theatre. Not 1-to-1, not even odds. 2 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Lightning lost. October was better. 3-to-1 in some engagements. Japanese pilots started avoiding P-38 seconds. The intelligence reports coming from captured documents and interrogated prisoners all said the same thing. American twin-engine fighters had improved dramatically. They could turn now. They were more aggressive. Something had changed. The official reports from 5th Air Force headquarters attributed the improved performance to better pilot training, to new tactics developed by squadron commanders, to increased combat experience. Nobody mentioned control cable modifications. Nobody mentioned piano wire tensioners. Nobody mentioned a technical sergeant who decided that regulations were worth breaking if it meant pilots stopped dying. But the pilots knew. They talked about it in the ready rooms and the mess tents, compared notes on which aircraft felt better, requested specific tail numbers, traded information about which crew chiefs had modified which planes. The knowledge spread through the unofficial network that keeps any air force actually functioning. By October 1943, Lockheed's field representatives in the Pacific had started hearing reports about modifications to control systems. They investigated, found the piano wire tensioners, analyzed them, tested them, and quietly incorporated the principle into the P-38J production design that was being finalized back in Burbank. The P-38J, which began production in August 1943 but didn't reach combat theaters until December, featured redesigned control cable tensioning systems. The new system used spring-loaded tensioners that automatically maintained optimal cable tension regardless of temperature variations or cable stretch. It was more sophisticated than McKenna's bent wire, more reliable, more elegant, but it worked on exactly the same principle: eliminate slack, eliminate delay, give pilots instant response when they need it most. Lockheed never credited McKenna. never mentioned him in their engineering reports or their production documentation, never acknowledged that a field mechanic with no formal engineering training had solved a problem that their design team hadn't even recognized existed. The Army Air Force never investigated how the modifications had spread, never filed charges against McKenna or any of the other mechanics who'd installed unauthorized parts, never officially acknowledged that anything had been done wrong or that anything had needed fixing. Major Lynch submitted a commendation for McKenna in November 1943. It was rejected. The reviewing officer noted that mechanics who followed procedures didn't require special recognition. McKenna's service record shows nothing unusual about his time at Dobodura. Standard performance reviews, standard efficiency ratings, no medals, no commendations, no acknowledgement that he'd changed anything. But the pilots remembered. Lieutenant Hayes wrote about it in his diary, mentioned McKenna by name, described the modification, explained how it had saved his life and the lives of his squadron mates. That diary survived the war. Hayes donated it to the Air Force Historical Research Agency in 1978. Researchers found it decades later while cataloguing Pacific Theater documents. Other pilots mentioned it in letters home, in post-war interviews. In reunion speeches delivered 50 years after the events, the story got passed down, embellished sometimes, simplified other times, but the core truth remained consistent. A mechanic had fixed a problem that everyone else had ignored, and pilots had lived because of it. James McKenna was rotated back to the States in March 1944, assigned to a training depot in California, promoted to Master Sergeant. Spent the rest of the war teaching other mechanics how to maintain P-38 seconds. After the war, he went home to Dayton, worked as an aircraft mechanic for various airlines. Eventually started his own aircraft maintenance company, retired in 1973. When aviation historians tracked him down in 1986 and asked about the piano wire modification, he was surprised anyone remembered. He'd assumed it was just one of hundreds of field fixes that mechanics made during the war. The kind of practical problem-solving that happens when you're trying to keep aircraft flying under combat conditions. Nothing special, just mechanics doing their jobs. The P-38J, incorporating the improved control cable tensioning system that McKenna's field modification had proven necessary, entered service in December 1943. By mid-1944, the J model had largely replaced earlier variants in combat theaters. The improved control response was just one of many refinements that made the J model the most capable Lightning variant of the war. But the timing matters. From January through November 1943, P-38 pilots in the Pacific had struggled with control response delays that cost lives. From September through December 1943, after McKenna's modification spread through 5th Air Force squadrons, kill ratios improved dramatically. The P-38J arrived in theatre after the problem had already been solved in the field. Official histories of the P-38 development mention the improved control systems of the J model. They credit Lockheed's engineering team. They note that combat experience informed the design improvements. They don't mention that the combat experience consisted of mechanics bending piano wire in maintenance tents at forward airfields because pilots were dying and nobody in authority would listen. This pattern repeated throughout the war. Field modifications that contradicted engineering, specifications, unauthorized parts fabricated from salvaged materials. Solutions developed by enlisted men who understood that survival mattered more than regulations. And then, months or years later, those same solutions would appear in production aircraft with no acknowledgement of where the ideas had originated. The dive recovery flaps that became standard on late-model P-38 seconds starting in June 1944. Field modifications had been testing similar concepts since early 1943. The improved intercooler system on the P-38J, forward depot units had been bypassing thermostatic controls since North Africa. The upgraded cockpit heating, mechanics had been rigging auxiliary heaters from salvaged parts for 2 years before Lockheed made it official. Every improvement told the same story. Engineers designed systems based on theoretical requirements. Combat revealed practical problems. Field personnel developed fixes. Months later, official production incorporated the solutions without crediting the sources. This wasn't malicious, it was bureaucratic. The Army Air Force couldn't officially endorse modifications that violated specifications, even when those modifications saved lives. Lockheed couldn't acknowledge that their production designs had flaws that mechanics with no engineering degrees had to correct. Everyone involved understood the reality, but nobody could admit it in official documentation. So the mechanics stayed anonymous. Their innovations got absorbed into production designs with no attribution, and the official histories recorded that American aircraft improved steadily through the war, thanks to excellent engineering and rigorous testing, with no mention of the men who actually solved the problems. James McKenna's piano wire tensioner was one piece of wire in one aircraft on one morning in August 1943, but that one piece of wire spread to 40 aircraft by September, and those 40 aircraft helped shift the kill ratio from 1 to 1 to 3 to 1. And that shift in kill ratios helped 5th Air Force establish air superiority over New Guinea. And air superiority enabled the ground campaigns that pushed Japanese forces back through the Pacific Islands toward Japan itself. Military historians can trace strategic outcomes back through operational successes, back through tactical advantages, back through technical improvements, back through field modifications, back through individual decisions made by enlisted personnel whose names don't appear in the history books, one mechanic, one modification, one night. And 11 months later, the P-38J rolled off production lines with control systems that worked on the exact same principle. Lockheed's engineers had reinvented McKenna's solution, made it more sophisticated, more reliable, more manufacturable. But the core insight that cable slack killed pilots and needed to be eliminated came from a maintenance tent in New Guinea, not from an engineering office in California. This is how innovation actually happens in wartime. Not through orderly processes and official channels. Through field-expedient solutions developed by people who see problems every day and who care more about solving them than about following procedures. Through unauthorized modifications that spread through informal networks because they work. Through mechanics who risk courts-martial to give pilots a fighting chance. The P-38 Lightning earned its reputation as one of the war's most versatile fighters. It excelled in the Pacific theater. It served with distinction in Europe and North Africa. It performed reconnaissance missions, bomber escorts, ground attack sorties, and night fighter operations. By war's end, P-38 pilots had destroyed more Japanese aircraft than pilots flying any other American fighter type. But for 9 months in 1943, in the crucial period when 5th Air Force was fighting to establish air superiority over New Guinea, the Des Lightning's reputation hung by a thread. Pilots were dying. Kill ratios were unacceptable. The aircraft that should have dominated was struggling against an enemy fighter that was technically inferior in almost every measurable way. One mechanic fixed it, not through official channels or proper procedures or authorized modifications, through bent piano wire installed without permission in aircraft that performed better because regulations were worth breaking when lives were at stake. James McKenna died in March 1998 at age 81. His obituary in the Dayton Daily News mentioned his military service and his career in aircraft maintenance. It didn't mention the modification, didn't mention the P-38 seconds, didn't mention that he'd solved a problem that killed pilots, and that Lockheed's engineers later incorporated his solution into production designs, without ever knowing his name. The historians found his story anyway. Cross-referenced pilot diaries with maintenance, records with engineering reports with field modification documents. Pieced together what had actually happened in August 1943 at Dobodura, figured out who'd done it and why and how it had spread. But McKenna never sought recognition. When asked about it in 1986, he just shrugged and said it was his job. Fix the planes. Keep them flying. Do whatever it takes to bring the pilots home. That's what mechanics do. Sometimes, the most important innovations are the ones that never make it into the manual. The field fixes that work too well to ignore, but can't be officially acknowledged. The unauthorized modifications that spread through informal networks because everyone knows they're necessary, even though no one can say so in writing. The P-38 Lightning became a legendary aircraft, but its legend was built partly on bent piano wire installed by a mechanic whose name didn't appear in the official histories until researchers found it buried in forgotten documents, 70 years after the war. That's how wars are actually won, not just through brilliant strategy and superior technology and industrial capacity, through technical sergeants who stay up all night bending piano wire into Z-shapes because they've watched too many pilots die from a 3/8-inch problem that everyone else says doesn't exist. McKenna fixed the problem, gave pilots instant control response when they needed it most, changed the kill ratio, helped win air superiority over New Guinea, and then went back to his regular maintenance duties like nothing had happened. The army didn't give him a medal. Lockheed didn't acknowledge his contribution. The history books didn't mention his name until decades after his death. But Lieutenant Robert Hayes and the other pilots who flew modified P-38 seconds knew. They knew that somewhere between regulations and reality, a mechanic had decided that pilots' lives mattered more than specifications, and that decision, repeated 40 times across 5th Air Force squadrons in September 1943, made the difference between acceptable losses and air superiority, between theoretical engineering and practical survival, between following the manual and actually winning the war. Sometimes the distance between defeat and victory is 3/8 of an inch of cable slack, and sometimes the only people who recognize that are the mechanics with dirty hands who actually touch the machines every day and who care enough to risk everything to fix problems that everyone else says aren't real. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.